Hey guys, welcome to episode 8 of The Balanced Lens, where we examine faith, culture, and politics from a Christian worldview. Now, today we are talking about Venezuela. You might be asking yourself, why are we talking about Venezuela? We have no shortage of problems here in America. Expensive housing, college costs are astronomical. 20 to 40% of people live along the poverty line, if not just above the poverty line. We have a fentanyl crisis, a healthcare system that's in shambles. So the U.S. is in Venezuela or near Venezuela with the military buildup. As a nation, aren't we supposed to be America first? So in terms of military buildup, let's start there with the current news. What exactly is happening?
It's a fascinating story that's unfolding around the shores of Venezuela. And this goes back a while, right? And so if you think about what's going on in July of like 2024, last year, interestingly, Venezuela moved troops and some equipment towards Guyana because they had a referendum in December 2023, supposedly, in Venezuela, and they claimed sovereignty over that area. And that story is a separate segment of itself, because that spans a couple of centuries. That's how old that story is. But Venezuela did that. Neither the UN or the US, nobody recognized this move by Venezuela. And just so the audience is aware, like what they were trying to take over was about 2/3 of Guyana. That location controlled a majority of their oil deposits as well. In this referendum, Venezuela states that they have a separate Venezuelan state now. This part of Guyana, they call it Guyana Essequibo, right? And the tensions just continue to escalate. Now, the U.S. has an obligation to Guyana because we are a partner under the Inter-American Treaty. So our Southern Command, the U.S. Southern Command, started doing joint flight exercises with Guyana around that time. And then in spring and summer, there were some rotational deployment of our naval vessels starting to pop up there. There was no formal war mobilization or anything, but it was a sign that we are willing to intervene if needed. Now things start continuing to build up, right? And like you see, for example, like now we have vessels out there. We have our attack vessels. It's a serious show of strength right now that is happening in the Venezuelan peninsula. We are trying to make sure our official statement of what is going on is that Venezuela is one of the major players in moving around narcotics, which is affecting hundreds of thousands of people in the US. And that's one of the stated goals. So one of the big show of strengths that everybody has seen on TV is the US blowing up vessels, suspected narcotic vessels off the ocean. There have been like several fatalities, I think around 90 fatalities so far. I believe it's around 20 plus strikes. So it's a serious show of strength and our determination to stop those type of activities that are starting to impact American lives. The second is the geopolitical issues, right? There's been, and we will get into this further down today's podcast, but there's been illegitimate elections happening in Venezuela. And so there is a serious stance from the US that we are not happy with the current government because they're not democratically elected by the people of Venezuela.
Yeah, and to put this in perspective, this military buildup is not a few Coast Guard ships off the coast. There's this formidable naval and air presence off of Venezuela's coast. The U.S. is calling this Operation Southern Spear, and it's certainly been an escalation in the last few months that's drawn a lot of global scrutiny. Now, to give you an idea of these ships that are there, right, there's the USS Gerald Ford. This is the world's largest aircraft carrier off the coast of Venezuela, and is supported by this formidable presence of ships. There's guided missile destroyers, the USS Winston Churchill, USS Mahan, USS Bainbridge. I'm butchering some of these names, but I want you to get the idea. This is not like a small deployment here. There's amphibious assault ships, the USS Iwo Jima. There's a stealthy nuclear-powered submarine there off the coast of Venezuela, all just miles off the coast. That's the naval presence. Now, you also have F-18 Super Hornet fighter jets. They've carried out a lot of patrols along the Gulf of Venezuela. There's B-52 and B-1 bombers tracing the coastline. You have surveillance drones. You also have about 15,000 troops between the naval and air presence off the coast of Venezuela. Just to give you an idea, this is not a small operation here. So when you see like drones hitting these narco smugglers right in the ocean, there's a lot more out there than what the news is actually telling you about. So this is a huge, massive military buildup. And as you alluded to, Biju, the reasons cited by the administration has been drug trafficking, narco terrorists that are essentially transporting drugs into the US. But there's much more, right? This was really deep. And so we're going to try to tackle some of this right now. And context is important. So we want to go back, just a few decades, look at the Venezuelan economy. So looking at the Venezuelan economy, what are some important things that we should know about the Venezuelan economy before Hugo Chavez took office?
This is very important, and I was surprised by how much I do not know about this topic. So Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in not just in Latin America, but also growing power in the world. It is one of the, I believe, the top 20 or so countries. It is, just so everybody's aware, it is the number one proven oil reserves country in the world, right? That's Venezuela. It's a very, very wealthy nation. Now, the type of oil reserve it has is extra crude oil. So it does require extra processing because of that. But it's one of the wealthiest countries because of that. And their GDP like skyrocketed. And they were a thriving economy early. We're talking 1950s through the 1970s. And just so people have perspective, between 1950 and 1980, the GDP per capita rose from $2,000 to $12,000, which is among the highest in the regions. What happened, obviously, in the 1970s is very important because that's a critical juncture in 1976 when they nationalize the oil sector and they create create a company called the PDVSA, which is a state-owned oil enterprise. And so people also have perspective. About 75-80% of the export revenue was oil. Heavy oil-dependent economy, and about 30% of their GDP was also like based on oil in the mid-1990s. We have before Chavez, so we have this oil boom that's happening. If everybody remembers the 60s, the 70s, everything's going well. The government gets greedy, starts nationalizing it. So 1970, that happens. Then there's a recession that happens in the 80s into the 90s. So there's a recession, there's high inflation, there is a debt crisis starting to loom because now remember, because the economy is heavily dependent on oil, what happens then is you are now slave to the ups and downs in the oil market. And so when things go well, prices up, your economy booms. When the price goes down, it just immediately tumbles. Then if everybody remembers in 1990s, there was a banking crisis where there was a collapse of like 18 banks in Venezuela, and there was a lot of bailing out happening, which means their debt started to go up. Around 1996, as things started becoming worse, inflation peaked, and we were talking about like 103% inflation, which then meant that poverty started to continue to rise. From being a wealthy nation in the between 50s and 70s, now by 1980, the poverty level was at like 25% or so, and then by 1996, it was 65% poverty, and it's only gotten worse since. How much a swing this country took from the 1950s through to Chavez's time.
Yeah, it's insane. Most independent observers state that Venezuela has more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. And as you alluded to, this was the richest country in Latin America, one of the richest countries in the world in the 70s. And a lot of instability, as you mentioned, in the 80s and 90s. And it's important to note this is before Hugo Chavez, right? A lot of people just look and say Venezuela, socialism, shoot the arrows at Hugo Chavez. This is before he came to power. And there were a few causes of this instability, and you alluded to some of these, Biju. One was over dependence on oil, right? There was a lack of diversification. And so when these global Oil prices collapsed in the mid 80s due to an international glut. The economy contracted, inflation soared, and so there was a lack of diversification. Oil was their thing. There was nothing but oil fueling the economy. Tangential to this, along with a lack of diversification, this dependence on oil caused appreciation of their own currency. As a result, these booming oil revenues, while good for the country, they made non-oil sectors like agriculture and manufacturing less competitive, and fostering this dependence on now imports and neglecting diversification again. Thirdly, what a lot of people cite as a huge problem in Venezuela has been corruption. Widespread corruption, sadly, in Venezuela, probably due to this enormous influx of oil revenue. Unfortunately, this created mismanagement, corruption. Between 1972, people estimate that between 1972 and 1997, people estimate that over $100 billion were embezzled in the country, right, leading to economic stagnation, which essentially made any type of political reform nearly impossible. And so, a sad story of an amazing, wealthy country, right? Now, American companies were also involved in Venezuela. This was beneficial to the American economy as well. What were some of those companies and how did they participate in their Venezuela-US relationship?
Very involved, especially prior to 1976. So the main companies, all the main companies we can think about, which is Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf Oil, they all operated in the region and was heavily involved in developing the oil. Like I mentioned earlier, we're talking about really extra crude oil, which means it's something to keep in mind, because if you really depend on your partners to get this going, this operation, it's not just a simple turnkey because of the type of oil they have. So the nationalization happens in 1976, and then foreign operators at that point are removed from a direct participation, but they are still able to continue their partnerships. But it should be via the state-owned oil company, which is the PDVSA. So that happened in the 1990s because they saw deterioration of all the things that happened, like we were talking about inflation, the economy. The presidents at that time reopened the fields and welcome international investors, and then Exxon, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, they do go back, invest billions, because one of the things people don't understand about the oil industry is like you do have to keep investing and make sure that the infrastructure is sound and maintenance happens. So one of the things that happened as, and we will touch on this later, and as things get really tough in Venezuela, they lose a lot of these investments from key partners, but they also lose a lot of their internal expertise because of the internal corruption that's happening and the politicization that's happening. So that happens in the 1990s. We are now fast forwarding to the 2000s. In the 2010s, there is again a push for nationalization, at which point again American companies are out of the region. So this shows the ebbs and flow of their internal thinking, even as they're going through internal conflicts and they're trying to give motivation to their citizens on what they're doing and how it's the outside companies that are causing these issues. And there's a lot of those weaponizations that happen internally as you think through the politics. But American oil companies were very critical to the development of the oil refineries and just the overall production of oil in Venezuela. And what happens as a result of their missteps is that their production significantly takes a nosedive. Their peak production was like 3 million barrels per day, and then it just drops to like less than 400,000 barrels per day in the 2010s. That's how significant their drop was, and it gives a stark view of how their economy, which is fully dependent on the revenue that is coming in through oil, then was starved of that revenue.
Yeah, and to add on to your points, there was a very close intertwined relationship between U.S. companies and Venezuela for decades. As you alluded to, Venezuelan crude oil is very heavy, needs to be refined. American companies are right there across the Gulf of Mexico, ready to lend their infrastructure. And so the U.S. and Venezuela developed a very close relationship for many decades. In the 1990s, 60 to 70% of Venezuelan oil was refined here in the U.S. Now, there was instability in the 80s and 90s due to all the problems we mentioned. 1999, Hugo Chavez comes to power, right? And the economy changes. Initially, it was good. There was a surge in global oil prices. GDP per capita actually rose to about 13,600 in his first 10 years. Total GDP expanded. Poverty was cut in half to 27%, from 58% to 27% in 2008. But he started nationalizing a lot of the industries in Venezuela in the late 2000s. And this started to cause some very significant structural problems. How exactly did the economy change after Hugo Chavez?
So to be fair to Chavez, right, it was not great before he took over, but his actions did the reverse of what they were thinking that it should do. And these are some of the lessons we can learn from countries and the decisions we make, right? So when Chavez and others take on these type of government-run programs, the intent is not necessarily initially bad, right? They're trying to do the right thing, but you do have to have a disciplined mechanism to make sure that those things that you put into place are running correctly. There is no corruption. There's always a tendency to control the information, and as soon as you control information, it just becomes really secretive, and it just goes downhill from there. Either way, so Chavez gets elected December 1998, takes office in early 1999, and then immediately he starts pushing towards a more socialist economic model. And he creates like currency controls in 2003. Then there is widespread nationalization in the towards 2007 to 2012. Electricity, telecom, steel, cement, agriculture, everything gets nationalized, right? So he thinks that the solution to the problems is nationalizing all the industries. Now, remember, even now, the economy is heavily, heavily dependent on oil, and they have not been able to successfully diversify their GDP with the other key industries that need to have, so you can have a rounded economy. It's like a petro economy. It's a petro state, like in its clear definition. So just before Chavez takes power, we're talking 1998. That's when it's like 3.4 million barrels per day. That's the production. It goes from there. Now you fast forward to 2013, from 3.4 comes down to 2.6 million barrels per day. After that, to be fair to Chavez, there are sanctions that are starting to come in, right? And as the sanctions come in, the production goes down even further. By 2020, we're talking about 400,000 barrels per day. So for a country to forgo from 3.4 million to less than 400, and a country that is completely dependent on oil revenue, you can only imagine the impact. It leads to hyperinflation. Around 2017 it starts. We are talking about hyperinflation. So like just an IMF estimate in 2018 is 130,000% inflation. I don't even know what that means. That's how high the number is. And so the economy shrinks between 2030 and 2021 by 75%, which per IMF data, it is the largest peacetime collapse of any war zone countries that they're talking about. And this created also a mass emigration from the country. We're talking about somewhere between 7 and 8 million people leave Venezuela due to the hardships. For context, this country is like about 30 million people. So 25% of the population exits the country. And so this has a huge humanitarian crisis, because now all the countries around there, Peru, Chile, etc., are absorbing immigrants and trying to. So there's a huge instability in the region that's happening. That is also provides context on why some of these policies had dramatic negative impact on the economy, on people, on social life. Poverty skyrockets. It's just in shambles, complete shambles.
Yeah, and he called this 21st century socialism. He wanted to use oil revenues to fund these ambitious social programs. Initially, he did reduce poverty. He did improve access to education. However, the nationalization and all these takeovers, they led to severe long-term negative consequences, right? Like you alluded to, sharp declines in production, cement output fell, steel production plummeted, overall agricultural industrial efficiency just fell. Specifically, there was capital flight. People didn't want to invest money anymore because, if I build a factory, who knows? Is Chavez going to come in now, take it over, right? There was a collapse in a direct foreign investment. People now don't want to invest in Venezuela because what's going to happen if you put $1 billion into starting a company in Venezuela, right? You create this very hollowed out private sector. People don't want to start companies. They don't want to invest in their own country. And so all this really exacerbated Venezuela's oil dependency and vulnerability, especially as prices crash. So, like you mentioned, this combination of like nationalization and price control and politicizing every aspect of the economy at state firms like, PDVSA, like you mentioned, it contributed to this huge economic contraction, hyperinflation, widespread shortages, and so on. So Chavez, right, his successor now, Nicolas Maduro, steps in 2013, almost his protege here. So did his protege, Nicolas Maduro, who's now, the current leader, if that's what you want to call him, right? Did he help the economy? What was life like under him, between, 2013 to right now? Uh, has there been a change in course?
He just doubled down on all the policies, right? And so just like, we talked about some of the issues that we're having in the production activities, right? So since oil is a big part of the economy, the reason why this goes downhill is not just purely because of nationalization, right? So you can, if you do it the right way, these things can work. I'm trying to make sure that we are giving a balanced perspective here. But what Chavez does, right, in the early 2000s, when he's nationalizing this the PDVSA, he eliminates like 10,000 employees. These are highly skilled technicians and
Right.
operational managers. He replaces them with people that are loyal to him and they are not technical experts. And this causes a big issue because now you're losing people who know how to do the work. What it reminds me, I'll give you a decent reminder. What this reminds me of is like, it's not a great parallel, but I'm just saying, Elon Musk takes over Twitter. There is a firing that happens. But one of the things that Musk, because he's a genius, what he does, he brings back the people that he fired because he realizes there are certain things that can't run without them. They are the technical experts. They are the people who stand in the gap and make the process flow. So to Elon's credit, he brings them back, and now you see Twitter is back up and running. Not so with Chavez. And this is where the issue becomes. And then as Maduro takes over, right, he doubles down on these policies. We're talking about over 30,000 employees leaving the state-run oil company. So the people who leave are the ones with institutional knowledge and expertise. And so there's again a mass exodus from this company that you have created as a state company that needs to run your entire, like it is a major source of funds for your economy, and you're losing all the experts that you need. And you think that you need to have people who are loyal to you over the people who know how to do their job. So I'm just giving you the reasons why it just keeps spinning out of control. And this is one of the things that is a big red flag in some of the socialist economies that we see. When there's nationalization, there's always this fear, and there is this demand of loyalty then that makes information become more scarce, and people stop sharing their true feelings and thoughts. Freedom of speech is curtailed. Opposition is like beat down. And then you get to the point where you are. I know I went on a tangent, but Maduro just made things worse. And then to give him some credit, there was a lot of pressure externally. Geopolitics played a big part in also the economy getting shrunk as much as it did because the U.S. imposed sanctions. There was an oil embargo, and so oil could not come from Venezuela to the U.S. U.S. was Venezuela's number one customer. 70 to 80% of his exports was to the US. So it really impacted them. There are a few countries that still prop them up, like Russia and Cuba and China, but they are struggling based on the US isolating the country and trying to get it back on track with the proper political system in place.
Yeah, so Maduro essentially, like you mentioned, he continued a lot of these policies. Also, had stricter price caps, more currency restrictions. He tried to launch an oil-backed cryptocurrency called the Petro, aimed at bypassing international sanctions. That also failed and was discontinued due to corruption. He did try to do an economic 180 in 2019. facing like hyperinflation and like threat of collapse, he tried to tolerate like this de facto dollarization, trying to peg things to the US dollar, tried to ease price and exchange controls, tried to allow more greater private sector activity, limited foreign investment in oil. It sparked a modest recovery, but it did not solve their problem because politically, he still consolidated power. He empowered the military in governance. He suppressed protests. He navigated contested elections, right? In fact, I don't know if there's been we're going to talk about that next, elections in Venezuela, but he tried to launch an initiative called the Transformations, which essentially tried to strengthen its alliance with BRIC nations, create more economic diversification. However, all of this, critics saw this as just a continuation of, essentially Chavez's policies, though he did try to fix some of this. But economics ties so closely to the political reality in a country, right? Did the people actually want this in Venezuela, right? Have there been free elections in Venezuela? Marco Rubio just came on last week. He said that Venezuela is not a legitimate government, but a trans-cocaine shipping organization, right? The state of democracy in Venezuela has been very frail. What's been going on there in terms of their politics and their ability of voters to be represented there?
So again, early on, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 1990s, they were a model country early on in the between 50s and 70s. So people looked out for the Venezuelan model. We should remember and keep that in mind. And the elections, for the most part, were okay and did not have any red flags up until, like, say, 2012, which means Chavez was fine. Like, he was a democratically elected president and he tried his policies. But then soon after that, right, 2013, you have the Maduro coming into power. So Chavez dies and Maduro wins the next election. But he wins by a very thin margin of 1.5%. And independent watchers, the OAS, which is Organization of American States, they all note that there are irregularities in that election. Now, they did not invalidate the result, but they were concerned that it was not happening fairly as early as 2013. Then comes the 2015 National Assembly election, which the opposition wins, like 2/3 majority, right? So that was fine. And that 2015 National Assembly election is the last election that has been considered legitimate internationally. Since then, it's been downhill for the last 10 years. So 2018 presidential election happens. All the leading opponents to Maduro were barred from even competing. So this was like Henrique Capriles and Leopoldo Lopez. And therefore, the US, EU, all these countries refused to recognize the results starting in the 2018 elections. And the turnout was only 46%, which is the lowest representation in an election. Then in 2020 parliament election happens, which the opposition just boycotts because they're like, you're just going to do whatever you want, so we're not even participating. The most recent cycle happened in 2024, where the leading opposition candidate, Maria Machado, was barred from running. She's the one, if our audience will remember, won the Nobel Peace Prize. So her replacement runs, which is Edmundo Gonzalez, and all independent watchers who have been watching the election say that he outperformed Maduro, right? Like, by far, based on like leaked tallies from inside the polling booths. But the final results, surprise, surprise, Maduro wins, again by a thin margin, and it's not recognized by the EU, OAS, US, or anyone, or any of even the Latin American countries. This has been a downhill. It just keeps going downhill. Right now, you have freedom of speech gone. You're imprisoning your opponents. You're no more democratic elections happening. It's just a sad state of affairs for a country that was once seen as a shining light that is going to be a role model country for the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's even been speculation about some of Chavez's later elections and how much he actually won them by due to like voter intimidation and media bias and things. There have been some free and fair, like international observers, like the Freedom House, Organization of American States, that have questioned those things. But to summarize, it's been bad. If you know nothing about politics, you know nothing about Venezuela, right? The last, 15 years of electoral integrity has been up in the air there. I have friends that are Venezuelan. I remember celebrated Christmas with them back in 2011, 2012. This is before Venezuela was really in the news and people knew what was going on there. But they give me detailed stories of government officials in plain clothes in every neighborhood. You would think that this is your normal John Doe, right? Washing his car, taking his dog on a walk, who actually were paid by the government to be spies. And so there were government spies all over Venezuela, right? Even, in the early 2000s when Chavez was controlled, watching people very carefully to see what was happening. There's a lot of speculation on really how free and fair any election was. But certainly the last election in 2024, uh, Maduro got blown out, right? He realistically got blown out by Edmundo Gonzalez. Everyone knows it. Somehow Maduro's still in power. Now, people look at Trump right now and they say, man, this guy's a maniac. He has warships off the coast of Venezuela. What's been going on? But in reality, this has been a buildup of sanctions against Venezuela and policies from the U.S. government for the last 10 years, starting with Trump 1 in his first administration and then, Biden's administration. During Trump's first term, his administration really ramped up the pressure on Maduro's regime in Venezuela. Some of the key moves included like slapping broad economic sanctions on the government and state oil company PDVSA to cut off funding, recognizing Juan Guaido as a legitimate interim president back in 2019, indicting Maduro plus a bunch of his top guys on drug trafficking charges. This was done by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York. This wasn't like Trump, going off on a tirade. This was a grand jury in New York. They pushed hard for humanitarian aid to get past the border. Tough stuff, right? Aimed at forcing change. Biden's team, right, kept the pressure on, but with more carrots than sticks, mostly sticking to targeted sanctions on Maduro's corrupted officials and military brass for human rights. Now, they did try to ease some of these oil sanctions in 2022 in exchange for reform. For example, they wanted to let Chevron pump and export oil, hoping it would boost the economy and maybe push for fair elections. In 2023, they inked a deal with Maduro for prisoner swaps and migration controls, extended TPS status for Venezuelan migrants a couple times. Overall, it was, pragmatic diplomacy, right, over a more authoritarian full court press. But all this to say, even with Biden's policies, it didn't budge Maduro much. The sanctions relief, the election deals for fair 2024 elections didn't work. He rigged them anyway. He claimed victory despite the opposition's clear win. Just got sworn in another term in January. He's still hanging on. The economy's a wreck. The U.S. has ended up with more problems than breakthroughs here. So it was a pragmatic try, but no real effective change through this attempts at diplomacy the last 8 years. Anything to add on there?
No, you pretty much summarized it all just as a summary, right? Trump's strategy was maximum economic and legal pressure, not surprising there. Biden's was targeted pressure with conditional engagement. So it was a really good, from one administration to other, it was a good carrot and stick strategy, even though that is not planned that way. It makes perfect sense to me when I think about it.
Yeah, so, for anyone that doesn't know about the situation, it's not like Trump woke up one morning and said, hey, let's send a warship off the coast of Venezuela. Like, that's what people think. This has been going on for a long time, right? This has been on the radar of, multiple administrations here. But now with this current administration, right? Trump's back in the saddle. How has U.S. policy towards Venezuela escalated or changed during the current administration?
It's the themes are very he's doubled down on it because we've given plenty of time for Maduro. Between the first Trump administration and Biden's administration, he's got plenty of time to change his ways. And in spite of the relief that the Biden administration gave him, he still rigged the elections, like you said. So there's no reason why he needs to stay in power. And as far as the whole world is concerned, the free world, the UN, the EU, we are all on the same page on this one. And it's important for us to make sure that Venezuela, what happens in Venezuela has an impact in the region, in the South American region, and has a direct impact on what happens in the US. So his method now, what he's now trying is much hardcore, and the hope is that he'll be able to shake Maduro out of power. But I'm sure people have heard that there was a recent conversation they did have with Maduro, the administration, and Maduro had ambitious requests in exchange for getting out of power, which the Trump administration rejected and just told him to get out of power. He did say, I think we did say that we will not prosecute and we will not pursue anything to prosecute him, but we are not going to give him a blanket getaway card from the United Nations or anything else.
Yeah, as Trump's been back in the saddle, he's been hitting Venezuela hard, like right out of the gate, designating like all of these Maduro-linked gangs as terrorist organizations. And, butchering the name here, Cartel of the Suns, right? Actions since February, just today, right? Seizing oil tankers off the coast to choke off their cash flow, ramping up these military moves in the Caribbean to curb drug and all these threats, floating a lot of invasion talk. Obviously, facing pushback from Congress, but the goal is clear, right? It's to hopefully secure the country. Um, there's also a bounty on Maduro's head. This is a bounty that is more than Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein combined. $50 million bounty. To put in perspective, Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein had bounties of $25 million. And so this is of critical importance in our foreign policy at this moment. The climax of this podcast, right? Why is this important to the US? Again, we started this off by saying you're sitting at home, you're thinking about rent, you're thinking about why college is so expensive or food prices are so high. What are the reasons why this should be important to us, even as Christians and as believers, like in the US?
This is a very important question because there are things like this happening elsewhere in the world, and we are not there everywhere, and we cannot. So we have to be strategic, we meaning the US need to be strategic in terms of where it chooses to focus and exert power and influence. And there's only a finite amount of resources and focus that you can have at any given time. So some of the reasons why it's important to the United States, right? Number one, like economic and energy stability and security. So Venezuela, as we have mentioned, has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, above 300 billion barrels of oil. Guyana, which it's trying to bully its way around, has another 11 billion or so. And Guyana is a major U.S. energy ally, which it's playing around with. So this instability is threatening U.S. refinery supply chains, global oil markets, billions of U.S. corporate investments. If you can think, like you said, mentioned about inflation and all the price of oil, if we can stabilize that region, that'll have a big impact in terms of the oil price. And if the oil prices comes down, it impacts almost everything, all the goods beyond that. The second is regional stability and security. You don't want to have too many instabilities happening in the continent because that's going to directly going to impact us. We also want to stop like other actors like Russia, Iran, Cuba, China, who indirectly support Maduro and his government, either through medical equipment, security, mining partnerships, loans, critical minerals. There's this back channels engagement that they have, and we want to kind of break it from our hemisphere. Then there is the organized crime issue, narcotics. The cartel, based on UN data, coordinated about 200 to 250 tons a year of cocaine transshipment. So they're considered to be a major corridor for Colombian cocaine. And this is not our data. This is from the United Nations itself. So it's a known fact that they are highly involved in organized crime around narcotics. Next point is all the instability in the region. We talked about migration issue. Like 7 to 8 million people, 25% of the population moving to other places. It affects the rest of the countries in Latin America itself and also like our own border. Then we do want to always figure out a way to have democratic norms in our hemisphere. It is in our best interest to not have governments that align directly with our economic and cross-regional rivals like Russia and China. So that's one thing we have always emphasized, preventing nations backsliding. We call it backsliding into these socialist, anti-democratic tendencies. Let me put it that way. It's not necessarily socialism itself that's a problem. So Venezuela matters, right? Energy, strategic stability, narcotics, migration, just regional geopolitics, democracy. So these are all the main reasons why we as a country take so much interest in Venezuela right now.
Yeah, I'll echo those points and add on to them, right? You mentioned energy security and global oil markets. Absolutely. That affects our inner cities. That affects rural America. That affects our middle class. Energy instability affects U.S. inflation, affects our allies, affects global markets, right? You brought up another excellent point, right? BRIC nations. You have Russia, China, and Iran in the Western Hemisphere. It brings up this idea of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is a foreign policy idea where the U.S. has this right or this obligation to make sure the Western Hemisphere is essentially cut off from quote unquote colonization or threats. It's like saying, I'm not only going to put a lock on my door, but I'm going to build a fence around my house in the front yard and backyard. So the problem is you have Russian military advisors in Venezuela. You have Chinese surveillance technology in Venezuela. You have Iranian arms and drone cooperation inside Venezuela. You have the IRGC, which is the Iranian, Revolutionary Guard. The IRGC and the Revolutionary Guard, they have a foothold inside Venezuela. And so Venezuela is now becoming this base of Iranian Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere. Now, think about this: China or Russia gaining operational control over a weak Venezuelan government. It's really bad, right? It shifts global energy leverage in a drastic way. And so the US sees these as hostile military footholds. Again, this has so little to do with drugs. I think, obviously the narco terrorism is important. Drugs are important, right? But there's so much more at play here than just drugs coming across our border. But this military presence sends a message. You can trade with Venezuela, but you can't build an enemy base here, in South America here. Another point you mentioned was Guyana. Now, most people may not know where Guyana is, but Guyana became really important in the last 10 years because they discovered a ton of oil there, back in 2015. Starting in 2019, Guyana has become this major oil producer, like you mentioned. Now, Venezuela, like you mentioned, has had this territorial dispute with Guyana forever. Suddenly, they really want them, right? Because now Guyana is a major oil producer. And so there's this provocation that Maduro has issued towards them to essentially annex them and take over a lot of the country. And so this stronger U.S. posture now says any foreign military aggression is going to draw this immediate response from the U.S. government and will make conflict less likely, likely preventing escalations. People who look at this and say, Trump said we're not going to be in another war. Why is there a military buildup? Well, really, I think we're preventing a really bad problem that could explode out of control in Venezuela by having U.S. military buildup there. Again, this is a signal to our allies in Latin America. It's regional reassurance to countries like Colombia, Brazil, a lot of the Caribbean states. It shows that we're still engaged. We still care about our allies and our neighboring nations, and we're not abandoning them to hostile powers. And so this is important. It was a valuable ally that's now been overrun, sadly, by corruption and unelected governments that don't represent the people. But as believers, right, and draw this back to the Bible, like, why should we care about this? Because for a lot of people, you're like, well, not at my doorstep yet. Just because you don't feel the tremors now doesn't mean the fault line isn't moving. Distance from danger is often temporary, right? It's not permanent. It's a job of government. It's a job of public policy and foreign officials and those that we elect to make sure that we're not only safe today, but we're also safe tomorrow. So a lot of times the waves that you don't feel yet, they're already forming, right? And we need our government to pick up the binoculars and see what is down the horizon that could hurt us. And so as believers, right, we should care. The absence of immediate impact doesn't mean permanent immunity. Right? This will affect us if we don't, it could affect us if we don't take action. And so, any final thoughts before we conclude?
It's the more I research this country and this topic, it's just a sad story of how a country that was supposed to be a role model and a rising star turned out to be the sad state of affairs it's today. It's a warning sign. It's a great, like, the things that countries can learn. Right, and this is something that I think I'm taking more interest in. It's like there's a lot you can learn by just looking around you and just tracking what happened, why it happened, and what can we learn from it. Like, I do agree with making sure that we are not spread thin, that we try to mind our own business in the US. I agree with some of the sentiments. However, we live in a very nuanced global economy, and you have to be realistic. Like you said, like how you were talking about, why should we care? Like whether it's Venezuela or other countries in the world, right? We can't go around the entire world and be a police. There's no way it's happening. It's not possible. but we have to be able to make strategic decisions on where to focus, especially when it advances U.S. interests in terms of its security, its wealth, right, and its societal and the norms that it tries to portray in the world. The world is a better place when we have countries like the US being the dominant power. I fear what it looks like in a world where the US is not the world power, because we know Europe has slipped back. So I think it is important for people to think about all these events from a very strategic perspective. Like, we cannot be so micro focused that we lose sight of what's going on in the world, right? Our progress and our security is all relative, which is why, by the way, we had a broader border crisis. If everything was just about the US, you didn't have to worry about the border. We still have a drug crisis. Drugs are still flowing into the US. Our lives are interdependent on what goes around in the world. If something happens in the other part of the world, whether it's India, China, Russia, it's going to have a direct impact on us, because whether we like it or not, we are now globally intertwined. We are not in an agricultural society where we can grow. I can grow carrots, you grow cabbage, somebody grows broccoli, and we have a barter system going and we are good and happy. If that were the case, fine. But that's not the world today, unfortunately. And we have all these interdependencies. So I think these kind of topics open my eyes myself, and that it's really fascinating to see how things are so intertwined, and it's not as it first seems in your first glance as you first read the headlines. There's more to it, and I think we owe it to ourselves and all of our audience owe it to themselves to be disciplined enough to dig deeper before forming an opinion on the matter.
You nailed it. It's a warning to us, right? The line between success and demise is often surprisingly thin, right? Venezuela is an example of that. Europe is going to be an example of that. The margin is, between triumph and success, it's narrow, and we should take heed. We should look at our country and ask ourselves, are we leading the country in a way that, God wants us to lead it, and exercising our rights as believers and as citizens in a way that would honor God with the resources we have. So again, fascinating topic. This has been really awesome. I have more I want to talk about. I could go on another hour, especially with what you just mentioned. Maybe we'll talk offline. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to The Balanced Lens. We hope you guys can like and subscribe and support our podcast. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you next week.